We'd like to thank you for joining us for another episode of Ears to Hear. Hello, Andrew. I say good evening. It's evening time. I know. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
Hello, John. Welcome all.
We're back after our 4-week hiatus, 4 or 5 weeks, something like that.
Yes, you thought you got rid of us, but we were just lurking, waiting to make our return.
It's all your fault.
It probably is all my fault. Well, we had our meeting week, and then I decided to leave town for a weekend, and then I got sick the next week. So my fault.
Good times. But anyway, we're back. We're throwing people off by having a cold open, no intro, no anything. So we're just going to launch into it this week, but we appreciate you joining us. Andrew, what are we talking about?
So today we wanted to talk about the topics of a sense of hopelessness or depression that seems to exist in the world.
Well, that sounds depressing in and of itself.
Depression even that can, in the end, lead to destructive tendencies. At the time that we're recording this, something that's big in the news right now, there have been back-to-back different violent shootings in different places in the country, one in Buffalo, New York, and then this week one in Texas at a school, an elementary school, which is, of course, nothing that's new to this country, but it's horrible to hear about and it's horrible to learn of. And every time these kind of things occur, it leads people to look at what leads people down a path where they decide to do something like this. How do they get this way? And, we're not psychologists, but...
Oh, we're having our first weekly disclaimer.
We're back to disclaimers. We're not psychologists, we're not therapists, but we wanted to look a bit at God's Word and see how God intended man to be, how God intended us to be in our lives, and how He intended us to cope with our lives. And I think there are concepts that we can look at here today that may offer some help in terms of ways that we might try to help ourselves if we're in a state of feeling hopeless about things, or ways that we might reach out to someone else that we see is spiraling down a path of depression and feeling hopeless.
Yeah, I will say I was recently, I overheard a conversation on a YouTube program, and someone had asked the question, and it was right after the shooting in Buffalo. And the question was, why are people hateful? And the answer was simply because of sin. It's like this is the nature of sin. The wages of sin is death. And this is what godlessness looks like. And like you said, it's nothing new, but it's still a great sadness. And I was just, I remember we read about when they came to Jesus and they asked about those Galileans who Pilate had killed. And it was a horrible thing. And the Lord also ties it in with a Tower of Siloam that fell on a certain number of people. And it was a horrible thing that there was bloodshed that was intentional with Pilate, and there was bloodshed that was accidental with the tower. But regardless, it was a great loss of life. And it was a horrible thing, and the Lord called them to think about their own mortality, frankly.
Yep.
And to realize that this life truly is fleeting. What we're going to be looking at today, we're going to be looking primarily in Genesis, but we'll tie in passages throughout Scripture with certain concepts. And to think in Genesis, and I tell you what, Andrew, go ahead, and I know you're primarily looking in James. Read from James about the verse about wisdom for us.
Yeah, so when I was looking at this issue, I was looking at kind of places in the Bible where maybe we could go to for suggestions or ways to help. So I was in James chapter 1, and there he's talking about, in the beginning of the chapter, he's saying to count it joy when you fall into trials. So he's talking about difficult times and difficult circumstances that could easily, turn a person sour or make a person go down a dark path. But he says the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And then here's where it talks about wisdom in verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways.
Yeah, and I know later on in the chapter it talks about receive with meekness the implanted word, and that you do not get to ask for wisdom and then not listen to God.
Right.
That this is how God gives wisdom. Now, to take that idea, and I was just thinking about, again, we're going to be looking primarily in the creation account and with Adam and Eve in the garden, and that the Lord gave him commandments, that he did not just leave it to Adam to figure things out, and that he told him, he put him in the garden, and I just wanted to start with that idea of teaching, that Adam had to listen to God, and Adam needed to listen to God. It is not within, other passages that speak about it is not within man to direct his own steps, that we need God's help, and that the wisdom that is from above, also talks about in James, the wisdom that is from above is first pure and peaceable and all of those things.
Yeah, and saying this to a lot of thinkers in the world sounds contrary, or it feels uncomfortable. The world wants to tell you that, no, you need to be self-determined, you need to be completely, your own person, and you're the one in charge of yourself. And I think what we're talking about is a lack of purpose. People can be free, but and freedom is, freedom from oppression by other people is a positive thing. But if we have no purpose in our life, if we're aimless, that can be a very destructive state.
Yeah. Well, we'll come back and we'll hit on that one some more as we progress through this. What was another passage in James you had? Seemed like you had one or two others.
Yeah, the other I had, which you referenced briefly further on in chapter 1, he's then talking about not straying into anger and instead steering down more positive paths. And I think, definitely when we see these outbursts of violence, this is a case of anger. People have this anger that they don't know where to direct it. They don't know what to do about it. They blame society, or they blame other people for their feelings of purposelessness, if I can say it, in life. So I was looking at James 1, and in verse 19 it says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his face in the mirror, and he looks at himself and he goes away, and at once he forgets what it was like."
Yeah. I want to just skim through James and to just think about, before we go to Genesis, in James chapter 1 and 2, you can tell there's some real disunity in the church. You have the rich man and you have the poor man. And you have people who are behaving partially rather than impartially.
Right.
And it's causing some real issues in the church. So you have this idea of disunity that's causing issues. You have the idea that you just mentioned about not just being hearers, but doers. And that's also James 2. That's faith without works. It's like you actually have to do.
Right.
You can't just hear. You actually have to do. Then you get into James chapter 3, and that's the passage I mentioned a little bit ago about wisdom, the wisdom that is from above. You also have the wisdom that is from below, the earthly, sensual, demonic, where there's envy and self-seeking and confusion and every evil thing are there. So you have this contrast going on. Then in chapter 4, it's where do wars and fights come from among you? That there was covetousness there, and also it's just worldliness, and it was just disruptive. They're also told to stop judging one another. Then in chapter 5, you have the same thing. You have greediness at the beginning, where they were withholding payment from those who are working for them. And then a call for patience. And then towards the end of the chapter, you have the passage about confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another,
Right.
that you may be healed. And that without that idea, you know, as we think about being confronted with sin, we have a choice to make. Are we going to take responsibility for our own sins, or are we going to blame others?
Right.
And go ahead.
The whole book is giving you a contrast of there's a way that the world might deal with these frustrations. You know, there's the sin that is from below. There's this worldly, sensual sin. There's trying to cope with things that's based on greed or based on self-satisfaction. So James is acknowledging and warning against going down that path. There's a divide when you're faced with these trials, or when you're faced with, like in chapter 1, he says, the one who doesn't ask, they go on doubting. When you have doubts, you know, there's a choice you can make. Are you going to try to do it?
They're unstable in all their ways. It says they're unstable.
Yep.
Because they're not walking by faith.
Right. Are you going to choose to address it by the wisdom that's from above, by spiritual wisdom, or are you going to try to address it with earthly wisdom and earthly teachers who are going to tell you what you want to hear?
Yep.
And so, you know, that contrast in the letter in James, I think kind of segues into contrast between us being created by God versus the way the world says our nature is, which maybe you want to get into some from Genesis now.
Yeah, let's go ahead and go back there and to just think about, how does the Bible help us with hopelessness? And I mean, in Genesis, obviously chapter 1, you have creation. And within creation, you have God saying in chapter 1 at verse 26, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. And that's how man is created. Now you contrast that with what people are teaching and believing today, and it's, well, we just came from chaos. We just came randomly. That we're just here by happenstance, and that somehow we came out of disorder. Well, if I'm just random, if I am just a product of chaos, is it any wonder that I would feel hopeless? Mm-hmm. If there is no greater, you know, why am I here?
Yeah.
If the answer to that is there is no reason why you're here, well, then that's depressing.
Yeah, critics of Christianity have at times accused Christians of, how could you be so self-centered? Do you think you're so self-important in the universe to say these things about the fact that you're created in the image of God? But by stripping that away, you strip away your own sense of self-worth that God has created us with. And you strip away the worth of other people that you see in your life. It's much easier to devalue other human beings when you think that, you know, nobody's loved in the eyes of God.
Right, and that ties in with, you know, the next point that I was going to make. They were given dominion over the animals. They were not just like all the other animals. Mm-hmm. God did not make all of the other animals in His image. He made man in His image, and you contrast that, again, with what people teach and believe today, and it's, well, we're just animals. No, we're not. And I would encourage people to be very careful going down that road because, just for example, you're not a dog. Are you a dog guy, Andrew? You don't have any pets.
We're in the process of applying for adopting a cat.
Oh no, not a cat.
Not a dog.
Andrew, we should probably go and cut this podcast short so we could talk about
No. We're not going to exclude any of our cat-loving audience or our dog-loving audience.
That's true. Some of our only listeners I know are cat lovers.
We're going to be very political about this and say we like all pets as long as they're legal and safe.
And the only point I was going to make is, if a pet becomes a nuisance, or if a pet becomes sick, or, you know, whatever the case. And my point is, there is the concept of putting animals down. To get back to seriousness, that if we are no better than animals, then we've got a problem, because people have been treated like animals before. And whether we're talking about, you know, World War II, whether we're talking about the Jews, whether we're talking about Africans, whether we're talking about whatever the case may be, people have been treated like animals. And it's horrible. It's horrible, and it's sinful, and it's wrong, and people are not animals. Mm-hmm. And when we teach kids, and when people believe that, oh, well, we're just another animal, it's like God says, no, you're created in the image of God. But if you believe we're just animals, that is a very depressing thing. Mm-hmm. Because all of a sudden that moves us into a system where we're just going off of our instinct. We're just going off of our passions. That there is no morality at that point.
Yeah.
You know, who's to stop? You know, you don't get angry at a lion or a tiger for killing. And for people to be upset about killing, there needs to be a recognition we are not just animals. And that you just have this contrast. And I think we see it in Genesis. They were given dominion over the animals. So he makes man. He puts him in the garden. I guess we should sort of do these in order. And this is the point where he's sort of made. He put him in the garden. This is verse 15 of chapter 2. The Lord God took man and put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. This is before sin ever enters the picture. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes people have the idea that work is bad, that work is somehow evil. And certainly he does speak about how the land was going to, what's he say? Later on, both thorns and thistles it shall bring for you. But that's after sin enters the picture. But before that, man still had work to do. That when God created man, he gave him a job. He gave him work to do. And we have just come through, you know, talk about your experience with the last 2 years of the pandemic.
Well,
where
I've had a very fortunate position in that, you know, there's been so many who have completely had their jobs changed or lost because of it. But even just the way that I work, I've been home, working from home. Yep. And
how crazy are you ready to go?
It's not good mentally some days. You know, there's definitely adverse effects of all that time separated from other people, and you know, you start to feel like, what's the value of what I'm doing, and you know who's actually seeing me, and you know, is there any good that I'm accomplishing here?
Now imagine if you had nothing to do at all.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, what are you occupying your mind with? Frankly, it's not occupying your time. It's what are you occupying your mind with? Mm-hmm. What are you dwelling on? You know, recently in class, we've been looking in Philippians 4, and it's think upon those things that are lovely and just, and, you know, all those things. There is something to be said about occupying our mind with good things.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the points that you had mentioned while we were talking this subject out is, like you're saying, if we're not occupying our minds, we have to be really careful about the information we consume.
Right.
And people who get into a state of you know, this hopelessness, they become very susceptible to any kind of information that's telling them what the world thinks they want to hear.
And let's pause right there, because the temptation is going to be the knowledge of good and evil. Mm-hmm. And that's what Eve chooses. And it's you have to be very careful about what you swallow, what you consume. Going all the way back to the garden, they had to be careful about what they consumed, and they weren't. Now, keep dwelling on that if you want to, just the idea of what we consume, you know, media-wise or whatever else.
Well, I've been thinking about whether or not to bring up this as maybe an example. But there is a phenomena, there's a group of people online, multiple groups online, that it's becoming more and more prevalent to tell, you know, young men, if they feel like they're dissatisfied, they can't get a girlfriend, you know, and they don't know what to do. And there's a growing community online that starts telling people, oh, it's actually because of just innate traits that you're born with that you have no chance. You know, your skull is too long, or you're too short, or you don't have the right body chemistry for the right muscle mass or whatever. And they start putting forward all these ideas that you should just give up trying, and that it's not your fault. It's other people's fault for just, you know, for not wanting you. And just that as an example of, there's information out there that is very destructive, and it gets people locked into a way of thinking where, well, there's no hope, there's no reason to improve myself because there's nothing I can do about it. It's everybody else's fault. And it locks people into this spiral of destructive thinking.
Would you say it seems like we've had podcasts, recently, before we were off for 4 weeks, about misinformation and disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And that idea of lying, and that the whole concept of lying, and that's what the devil is going to do with Eve. The devil's going to lie. He's the father of lies, is what he's called elsewhere in Scripture. And the whole idea of a lie, if someone believes a lie, what they are doing is they are disconnecting from reality. On some level, they are not believing what is true, and they are choosing some fictional fabrication. I think they're believing a lie.
I think lies as an escape is a very big topic that's tied to this idea of hopelessness.
And that whole idea of escapism,
mm-hmm.
and not being content with what you have. Eve, for whatever reason, was not content. God said, you can eat from every other tree, but not that one. And she thought, but I want that one, when the devil presents it. And the devil says, you will not surely die. And that was a lie. And she believed it. She believed it. And in believing it, she was deceived. And that whole idea of deception is what we're talking about. And we could have a whole, umpteen broadcasts on that. Different ways that people are deceived. Whether we're talking about what you just mentioned. I was thinking of video games. And I have a 17-year-old, and he doesn't do it too much, but there for a while he went through a video game phase. And I think people have to be very careful about making sure that they're not mistaking fiction for reality.
Mm-hmm.
And they better be careful what they consume fictionally, because what happens a lot of times is people consume, and the problem is, why are you consuming wickedness even fictionally? Namely, well, it's just fantasy. And I'm not saying all fiction is wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But why would you consume or fantasize about wickedness? What ends up happening is you start transferring fiction onto reality, and you start becoming, as you consume, you start manifesting those traits in reality, whether it's violence, whether it's immorality, whatever the case may be.
I'm going to disagree a little bit, but I do
You're wrong, Andrew.
I'm going to disagree a bit, because I don't think it has to be consuming wickedness in the form of media alone, or replicating what people consume in media, because there's been clinical studies about whether people replicate behavior in video games. But what I will
cite them.
What I will
say, expect peer-reviewed resources when you say there has been. Carry on.
Well, we do this very unresearched, so
don't mind me.
Hence
Carry
the disclaimers. What I will say is, just their nature is that they're very. Specifically talking about the example of games, it can be addicting, and it can be very time-filling, but there's no meaningful product generated in the end. So what it actually becomes is your non-real life interactions, you get more satisfaction from them than you do from your real life. And that's, I think, when you start seeing, again, that escapism and isolation. Someone could be playing something completely non evil, like, I don't know, Minecraft. Maybe
Minecraft is evil.
Maybe you don't like the concept of.
I've never played Minecraft. I have no idea.
There's cute little zombies, so maybe you don't like that. But it's a pretty tame game. Most people don't bat an eye at a child playing a game like Minecraft. But even that, where it's engaging and it's time filling and it's giving you the feeling of satisfaction when when you're done and you shut it off, you haven't made anything real or done anything to better yourself in real life. So you haven't been active. You haven't
making
been
my
communicating.
point for me, Andrew.
It's a replacement. Well, we were making the point.
You prefaced this whole thing with you disagreed with me.
Well, I think you were making the point that people might take sinful behavior out of media, and then that gets implanted into their real life. And I'm saying I think it goes beyond that. I think it's just people taking satisfaction from something that isn't real life. I was reading briefly about parasocial relationships where people can even take a fictional character or a cartoon or a made-up universe like the Marvel universe, and they become so invested in it that that's where they get their satisfaction from, and real life feels unsatisfying to them by comparison.
And would you say it doesn't compare? You just said in comparison. I think that reality does not compare to, I think the worlds that people live in.
If we're not good at telling ourselves what the distinction between realities and fantasies are, then we may feel like real life does become dissatisfying or unsatisfying by comparison. So, and I read too that it's common in children who maybe have experienced some form of trauma. They look for something to latch on to that is enjoyable or that they can feel comfort in, and a lot of times that may take the form of some substitute for reality.
Right. And they are trying. Again, we're not psychologists.
I know we're getting pretty perilous in our expertise here.
They are trying to escape reality. I don't think that's a newsflash to anyone that people try to escape reality.
Yeah.
The problem is that there's no escaping reality. That you're a person, and at some point you're going to have to deal with reality.
Eve could imagine what life would be like if she took of the fruit, and she thought about it. She dwelled on the idea.
Right.
And after Adam and Eve both sinned and they were faced with reality, their first inclination was to isolate. They wanted to escape from the reality that they found themselves in.
Right. We're not there yet. Hold on. We leapfrogged over a point or two I wanted to make. Before we get there, before we get to them hiding themselves, even before Eve was created, God said it is not good for man to be alone. And that idea that we are social creatures, that's what we are. Here, of course, he's talking about husband and wife. And I do think there's something, the story, the article that you just referenced, where you have people who are being convinced, frankly, that to be alone is a good thing. Or they're not putting it like that. But it is not good for man to be alone. And that we were created a certain way. We could talk about families, we could talk about the church. And that when people start isolating themselves, and here we will tie in what they do after they sinned, they isolated themselves. Isolation is not good. Mm-hmm. It is not good for a person's spiritual well-being. It is not good for a person's mental well-being either. It is not good. God says it is not good for man to be alone. And I would think the last 2 years would have taught us that. But I would think just life in general would teach us that. That when we're in situations where, we may be sick or whatever the case may be, and we're, cooped up and we're having to stay in our, we stay in bed for 2 or 3 days. After 2 or 3 days, we're ready to get out. Mm-hmm. And, we ought to think about, why did God create the family the way he did? Why did the Lord build the church? The whole idea of the church and coming together on the first day of the week and exhorting one another daily and all of those things. It's like there is a social, how should we put it, Andrew? We're social. We're supposed to be social. We need each other. We're supposed to need each other. It is more blessed to give than receive. Well, in order to have that whole relationship of giving and receiving, what do you need? You need somebody else.
Right. You need a network of support.
Yeah,
You need
that's
multiple
what
people,
you need.
connections between those people.
I mean, God makes Adam, and God real quickly is like, well, we got to make someone else. And he makes Eve. It's not good for man to be alone. And certainly we're not saying you have to get married. You know, for example, the Apostle Paul never got married. Barnabas never got married. So we're not and the Lord talks about there are those who are eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. He also says in the same context, not everybody can bear it. But some people can. But I've wondered, my own personal opinion here, some people who choose celibacy, for lack of a better way of putting it, it saddens me because some people are eunuchs, but they're not eunuchs for the kingdom's sake. They're eunuchs for their own sake, because they don't want to think about others. They don't want to learn to love others. They don't want to learn to sacrifice for others. They don't want to learn to depend on others. They don't understand all the benefits of others. And we were created for others, frankly. We were created for good works. What does that involve? Others. And it's not good for man to be alone. So that's one of the lessons we can learn from Genesis. We've already talked about, and I'm trying to go back chronologically, the knowledge of good and evil. You better be real careful what you eat. But she ate, then she shared with her husband. Let's see, what else do I have on my list? Oh, take responsibility. What was our point with take responsibility, Andrew? I think it was something along the lines of, you have the contrasting idea. Biblically, when we sin, what are we supposed to do?
We have to confess and repent of that. We have to seek forgiveness and change what we do.
From the world's perspective, when you mess up, what do you do?
Well, you could try to blame circumstances. You could try to blame things outside of yourself. And Christians do that too, by the way.
Sure.
So you can try to blame...
When they're acting worldly.
Yeah.
Frankly, it's like when we act worldly, that's what we do. And that's what Adam and Eve did. Right. Adam and Eve were created by God. And yet when God comes to Adam, what does Adam say? It's your fault because you gave me the woman, and it's her fault because she gave it to me. It's like, way to man up there, dude. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do. We try to blame others. And that is how the world operates.
Yeah.
That it's not our fault.
And this kind of goes back to back again to where we started in James, where after he says not to be angry, not to give in to anger, he follows that up with be doers of the word. So take action, receive the implanted word. That's an action that we need to partake in, and then be doers of the word. Put yourself to work, being busy. Doing the works of a Christian, being kind, being helpful and generous. It's hard to be isolated and stew in the soup of our own misery if we're going to instead decide, okay, I'm going to go out and try to help somebody.
That sounded very graphic. Stewing in the soup of our own misery. That was good. That was well put.
Well, I'm no poet.
But it's true. It's very much true that we have to take responsibility for our actions. And in taking responsibility for our actions and confessing our trespasses one to another, coming to the Lord, that what we end up finding is the answer. And as Adam and Eve, as they were confronted, you have the prophecy made. And it's actually the Lord speaking to the devil when he says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." And we know what it's speaking about. That we have, of course, the one who is foreordained before the foundation of the world. That we're talking about the Messiah. And that without Jesus, in Romans chapter 5 or 6, when it's, "O wretched man that I am, who will save me?" And the answer is Jesus. That, what hope did the Gentiles have without the Messiah? They had no hope. Mm-hmm. What hope did the Jews had? I was actually talking with someone recently. It was with my mother, and we were talking about Orthodox Jews today, and how, frankly, they don't keep the law. That, some things they keep, some laws they keep, but you go back and you read about the things in the old law, all the things in the old law. They don't do all those things.
Some of it's not even possible anymore.
Some of it's not even possible. And and yet they don't turn to Jesus. And it's like, the old law demanded that you keep the old law. What hope did the Jew have outside of the Messiah? It's like, no, the hope was in the seed that was prophesied. It was in Jesus. So Adam and Eve, they sinned. The prophecy is made. They're kicked out of the garden. They're eventually going to die. That's one of the things, when the Lord said, "Behold, man has become like one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man." And Adam's going to die. Eve is going to die. And that brings us to, let's come up to Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 4, as we're thinking about how does the Bible help us with, how did we phrase it? How does the Bible help us with hopelessness? This is Ephesians chapter 4, as it speaks about there is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called in one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. As it speaks about that, and let me look at it. Let me back up a little bit. Just as you were called in one hope of your calling. That concept of one hope of our calling. Paul actually refers to that numerous times when he's on trial, and I'm going to have to hunt for it, but when he's on trial and he talks about the hope of the resurrection. Mm-hmm. And that's, he talks about that's what he was being judged on.
Was that the occasion when he says, "I would that all of you were the same that I was, except for these chains," when he's speaking to Felix?
It seems like, because he does mention the resurrection there. I'm going to have to pull it up. Andrew, say something profound.
Profound. Well, I don't know about that.
Andrew,
being profound isn't something you can just flip a switch, John. But
okay. This is Acts chapter 23 at verse 6. "But when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, 'Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Concerning the hope and resurrection of the dead, I am being judged.' Later on in chapter 24 at verse 15, 'I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust.'" That in Ephesians, when it talks about one hope of our calling, the question is, well, what is that one hope? And when Paul talks about it, he identifies it. And it's like, this is the hope that we have. And it's the same hope that Adam and Eve and all the other, that everyone else, this is the hope we have. And when he talks about the resurrection in other places, I'm thinking 1 Corinthians 15, he's like, if it's only in this life, if this is all we got, this is pathetic. This is pathetic. Mm-hmm. That we have hope in something better. We have hope in the resurrection of the dead. That we have the hope that, the verse that we've looked at recently, that, how does it put it in 2 Corinthians, that mortality will be swallowed up by immortality, and that we will be, not that we want to be unclothed, but further clothed, as it says.
Right.
And that's what we have to look forward to, that even as we die, man is appointed man to die, and Adam and Eve died, and yet in looking to the seed and looking to the Messiah, we have, through his death and his resurrection, that we have hope.
Right. The path that we can take when we find ourselves depressed or find ourselves disappointed with life is completely different than the path that the world leads down. There are people in life who are truly dealt a horrible hand of cards, and they have horrible circumstances, and the world turns its back on them. The world does not try to help them. And it's no wonder that so many people find themselves feeling hopeless. There's no excuse for violence. There's no excuse to take it out on other people. But the world doesn't give a satisfying solution for so many people.
Let's pause right there for a second and think about who Jesus dealt with and who Jesus loved and who Jesus died for. You had lepers who were outcasts from society.
Right.
They literally had to scream, "Unclean, unclean," whenever anyone came near them. And yet Jesus came and touched them. You had tax collectors who were social pariahs. And yet Jesus says, "I'm coming to your house today." You had Gentiles, Roman soldiers. And Jesus is like, "I haven't found such great faith even in Israel." Mm-hmm. And the people around him are like, "Are you kidding me?" And whether we're talking about man or woman, and my point is, you're absolutely right that people find themselves in horrible situations. They did back then and they do today. And it is absolutely saddening with the shootings that you referenced, that people resort to that. Because, frankly, they're choosing the wrong path. And that for whatever reason, they feel like that is the answer. And that's not the answer.
Right.
It's just not the answer.
Yeah. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the information that we're consuming? What are we feeding our minds with when we're stewing in ourselves? Right. Are we trying to escape? Are we trying to isolate ourselves? And instead of anger, James says the path should be to receive the word and to be doers. So make ourselves busy at doing good. And also in James 1, ask for help. If we're lacking in wisdom, if we're feeling doubting, ask. Seek out help from God, and seek out help from God's people, and build connections that aren't escapism, but are real connections that can help us through life. And you'll start to see that with God's pattern and using God's way of doing things, the way He created us, we have more value, we have more purpose, and we matter more than the world is going to care about us.
I was just thinking there in James 1, let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Mm-hmm. And when desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Temptation is not the same thing as sin.
Right. It's a dividing path.
And it's, we've been talking about Adam and Eve. We could just as easily talk about Cain and Abel. When God rejected Cain's offering, and God speaks to him straightly and says, "Sin is at the door, but you should master it." And that with the Lord we can overcome. Mm-hmm. And that we can face temptation and trials, and we can come through it actually better and stronger. And we can have hope. We can have hope. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, I thought it was a good study, Andrew. This was a good idea. This was your idea to talk about this. I thought it was a...
Well, we came in cold and a little rusty from the break, but...
We knocked a little bit of the rust off, but we're not going to be here the next 2 weeks, and this time it's my fault.
Well, yes. Now that we've established that it was my fault before,
now, it was your fault before.
Now it's your turn.
Now it's my turn. So I'm going to be out of town. So we will not have a broadcast the next 2 weeks, but we will be back after that. But appreciate you, Andrew.
Appreciate you, John.
Yep.
Thanks everyone for listening.
Yep. Thanks everyone for tuning in, for having ears to hear. Everyone stay safe, and we'll be back in a few weeks.